Greed, militarism, and hypocrisy must be replaced by solidarity, diplomacy, and respect for human rights. It is a sad fact about Washington politics that some of the most important issues facing the United States and the world are rarely discussed seriously. And it is in foreign policy that this is maximized. For decades, there has been a bipartisan consensus in this area. Unfortunately, it has almost always been misguided. Whether it was the wars in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq, the overthrow of democratic governments around the world, or terrible economic policies such as the North American Free Trade Agreement and permanent trade relations with China, all have ultimately damaged the United States' standing in the world, undermined its proclaimed values, and had disastrous consequences for the working class. This is the same policy course we see today. The United States spends billions of dollars supporting the Israeli army. They are almost the only ones in the world to defend the right-wing extremist government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, which is engaged in all-out war and destruction of the Palestinian people, resulting in tens of thousands of deaths in the Gaza Strip, including thousands of children and hundreds of thousands more starving. Meanwhile, the panic over the alleged Chinese threat and the rise of the military-industrial complex is easily traced to the fact that Republican and Democratic leaders are often driven not by respect for democracy and human rights, but by militarism, groupthink, greed, and the power of corporate interests. As a result, the United States has become increasingly isolated not only from poor countries, but also from many longtime allies in the industrialized world. In the wake of these failures, a fundamental reorientation of American foreign policy is long overdue. It should begin by recognizing the failures of the post-World War II bipartisan consensus and developing a new vision centered on human rights, multilateralism, and global solidarity. Since the Cold War, politicians of both major parties have dragged the U.S. into disastrous and hopeless military conflicts abroad through fear and outright lies. Presidents Johnson and Nixon sent nearly 3 million Americans to Vietnam to support an anti-communist dictator during the country's civil war, guided by the so-called domino theory, the idea that if one country fell to communism, so would everyone else around it. The theory turned out to be wrong, and the war ended in total failure. Up to 3 million Vietnamese were killed, as well as 58,000 American soldiers. However, for Nixon and his Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, the destruction of Vietnam was not enough. They extended the war to Cambodia with a massive series of bombings that killed hundreds of thousands more and brought to power dictator Pol Pot, whose subsequent genocidal policies killed up to 2 million Cambodians. In the end, despite the enormous losses and costs, the United States lost a war that should never have been started in the first place. In the process, the credibility of the U.S. government in the world and among its own citizens suffered severely. Among other countries, Washington's reputation was little better at the time. In the name of fighting communism and the USSR, the United States supported military coups in Iran, Chile, Guatemala, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Dominican Republic, Brazil, and elsewhere. In part, these interventions were intended to support authoritarian regimes that brutally repressed their own people and spread corruption, violence, and poverty. Washington still faces the consequences of such interventions in the form of deep-seated suspicion and hostility in many of these countries, which complicates U.S. foreign policy and undermines American interests.